Hi, everyone. My name is Lily Duffield, and I'm representing EDF Action and Defend Our Future. EDF Action is the advocacy partner of the Environmental Defense Fund, which works across the aisle to build political momentum and mobilize constituents to advocate for our health and the environment. Defend Our Future is a project of EDF that aims to equip and empower people across the country with knowledge, tools, and resources to become effective advocates for their communities and the planet. I am here with Andrea Sosa from Young People For to talk about the mechanics of voting and to delve into the challenges Americans face when trying to vote and what we can do to fix them. Andrea, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and YP4?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Lily, for that beautiful introduction. My name is Andrea Sosa. I lead civic engagement and all of the civic engagement work at an organization called Young People For, also known as YP4. And essentially what YP4 is a social justice incubator. We provide lifelong social justice leadership development training to unlock the potential of young people that have historically been left out of opportunity. And what that specifically means for us is that we are a national network of that centers Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQ+, disabled leaders in all areas of government, education, media, politics, everything. And for us, at the core of social justice is civic engagement, and that's something that we ingrain in every aspect of the work that we do. Most recently, over the past 3 years, we've launched a campaign called Building Power to Win, with the purpose of really equipping folks in all states and territories to center civic engagement in their communities by centering the issues that they care about. And I'll talk a little bit more about this work a little bit later. I know we'll get into it. So you can see where you can have access to all of these resources and gain more information based off of this campaign that we've been doing.
Great. Well, Andrea, I'm so excited to be here with you today. So starting us off, this is obviously an election period unlike any other. Not only are we in the middle of a pandemic, but we are also amid a nationwide protest and battling multiple climate disasters. This is also an interesting election time for the youth of America because millennials and Gen Z now make up 37% of the eligible voting population, which means they have a pretty significant influence over the results. In the past, we have seen pretty low voter turnout from the younger generations, with only about 51% of eligible youth casting a vote in 2016. However, this election period brings new energy, but it's important that everyone knows the ins and outs of voting. So let's dive right in and tackle the big question: how do you register to vote, and what are the challenges with registering and voting?
Thank you so much, Lily, for that context. It's definitely super important to understand that young people currently are the largest voting bloc, and there is a lot of energy and a lot of mobilizing happening on the streets. And while there are many reasons why the quote unquote youth vote hasn't been the same as older generations, one of them is the barriers to voting. And I'll talk a little bit later about what some of those other prospective reasons might be. But when it comes to registering and voting, the barriers are pretty significant across the board and particularly affect young people, affect historically disenfranchised communities. So like you mentioned, it's important to make sure that our communities have access to this information. So one of the things that is the most important that folks should consider is making sure that you're registered to vote. There are websites like vote.gov that help you navigate what this process looks like. And actually, online voter registration is available for 39 states and DC as well. So like I mentioned, the first step, making sure that you're registered. It's really important to double check all of this because one, we're in the middle of a global pandemic and things are happening and changing by the day, it seems. But there's also a lot of voter suppression tactics that actually make it so that people who thought they were registered might actually not be registered. So it's important to think about things that are like voter roll purges, where some states actually purge people from their voter registration rolls because they haven't been active in the past couple of elections. So if you think that you're registered, always double check. And the second step is figuring out how you're going to vote. And again, this is, something that we really need to put a lot of thought into, specifically as we're in the middle of a pandemic that is changing and uprooting a lot of pieces of our lives. One is many states actually do have early in-person voting. So if that's an option for you, always make sure to check your local elections website to see what options are available. Some states do have early in-person, so you can avoid, long lines and crowds on election day. There's also mail-in ballots, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, I know. Some cities and towns offer drop-off locations for your mail-in ballots, or you can drop them off at a local election office. That's also an option for some. But the most important thing to know about mail-in ballots is that make sure it's done as early as possible. And we'll talk a little bit about what the mechanics look like, but that is one thing that I want to leave with everyone in terms of mail-in voting, is making sure that it's as early as possible. We know that there are not just these barriers to voting, like we mentioned. Mail-in ballots can be risky, and we'll talk about what some of those barriers are. But for example, one of the barriers that you need to be conscious of in terms of registering to vote is sometimes voter registration deadlines are weeks before the election. So make sure you know when your state has voter registration deadlines. Some states don't allow online voter registration, which means that you'll have to do a couple of extra steps. Always double check that information. And also know that sometimes folks in our communities might not have all of the information that they need to register. So it's up to us to educate our communities on what that process looks like and make sure that the information is accessible. There are also a number of barriers to actually casting your ballot. One of the things that we've seen a lot as a voter suppression tactic is voter ID laws. And I'm sure many of you have heard of voter ID laws, the folks that are watching. But 36 states across the US actually have a voter ID law. And basically what that is that you require a specific form of ID to be able to cast a ballot. And what this does is that it actually further disenfranchises folks that have historically not had access to the ballot. Folks like low-income voters, people of color, young people, folks with disabilities. For example, like in Texas, citizens are allowed to use their gun license to vote, but students are not allowed to use their student ID. Something also is, long lines at the polls. That's something to be mindful of, that are specifically polls in recent local elections that we've seen, polling locations closing in predominantly low income and Black communities. And also, voting by mail, we know that the USPS right now is in a precarious situation with suspected sorting machines being removed and misinformation about fraudulent mail by voting. But one of the things that we can do is support the USPS by calling on our legislators to make sure that this process is safe and it is legitimate and that it works for our communities.
Yeah, so first of all, great responses. Obviously we're going to touch more on these things. But so now that we've talked a little bit about, the challenges of registering and voting, what are some of the ways we can combat these in 2020 with the pandemic?
Yes, so there are lots of things that we can do. I mean, one is focusing on what those specific barriers are in your community and making sure that you are aware of what those barriers are and that your community is aware of them too. And then there's the second piece of making sure that your community is invested and knows exactly what's at stake this election. So those are the two pieces that I would say. The first piece about addressing the barriers is, make sure that you're registered to vote and the folks that you care about are registered to vote. Make sure that your community has accurate information. We know that Instagram has been a great source of information for a lot of people, specifically since a lot of the uprisings have been happening over the summer. But make sure that information is accurate. Double check your sources. Double check that the information that you're sharing is true for your community, and use those platforms to educate your community and the folks you care about. Also, we said that as we've seen in previous local elections, there are very long lines at the polls, specifically in low income and communities of color. And one of the things that right now is starting to show up as an issue is we know that COVID-19 presents specifically a risk for folks that are at risk, specifically older folks. And these are the folks that usually work as poll workers in our polling locations. So one of the things to be mindful of is if you are someone that is healthy and someone that may not have thought about registering to be a poll worker before, and you have the privilege of, being able-bodied and are not immunocompromised and have the ability to do that, that's something that you can consider doing to make sure that the polls on election day are not understaffed and that communities, specifically in these locations, have access to polling and aren't turned away because of a long line. And then the second piece is making sure that your community is invested. It can be very easy for folks to, we've been taught that elections and the things that we care about sometimes aren't necessarily connected. And making those connections in our community is actually really important. Understanding what your community cares about. If they care about, the environment, if they care about water quality, what are the positions that are up for election that actually control some of these things so that folks in your community know what's at stake. So I would say it's those two pieces.
Great. Yeah. That's amazing. Absolutely. I'd say the thing that I pulled the most out of that was check your sources. So let's talk a little bit about, what a mail-in ballot is. I know we kind of mentioned this before, but let's kind of delve more into that and how you can look up and request one. Just so everyone is clear, mail-in voting is conducted by mailing in a ballot before Election Day, and it is a legal and legitimate way of voting. And Andrea, I'll let you take it from there.
Yes. So mail-in voting, the conversation has popped up way more than it ever has before because of the pandemic that we're in. A lot of folks, mail-in ballots might be the only way they're able to vote because they don't have the ability to go to the polls on Election Day. And it's really important to understand kind of the context that we're living in. One, there is a very deliberate attack against the USPS, which is making it, which, as I mentioned, is putting it in a very precarious situation. But there are things that we can do to make sure that the USPS can effectively count our votes and effectively administer that process. And one of those is being as proactive as possible with this, with mail-in ballots. So every state actually has different rules and different deadlines for mail-in ballots. So some states have routinely conducted mail-in ballots, elections before. States like Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah. There are some states that, because of COVID-19, they actually have pledged to mail ballots to all registered voters ahead of November. This states like California, Nevada, New Jersey, Vermont, and DC actually as well. And some states have made it easier, but for some states, you still have to request a mail-in ballot. So you can request an absentee ballot in advance by either submitting an application or a mail-in application or applying online or in person. This all depends on the state. Actually, the Young People for Instagram has some really good resources that outline what some of those deadlines and some of those rules are. So it's important to figure out what your state, what the rules are in your state and what the deadlines are. And also be mindful that those deadlines may not always be enough to ensure that your vote is going to count. Like I mentioned, we are in a position right now where the USPS is being overwhelmed. It's underfunded. And there have been specific strategies to inhibit the effectiveness, especially leading into an election that is so important. So the key takeaway here is, regardless of what the deadline is, mail it in as early as you can. Mail it in as early as possible. And remember, you also have the option of, in some states, to drop it off in person. Check if there are drop-off locations in your locality. You may be able to drop it off at your election office, and that relieves some of the pressure on the USPS. But also, at the end of the day, always calling on our legislatures to support the USPS.
Yes, cannot emphasize that enough. Mail it in early. So now let's talk a little bit about how to fill out a mail-in ballot and the problems that arise here. Mail-in ballots can be a little bit complicated, and every year hundreds of thousands of them get rejected So it's important to know how to correctly fill out and package your ballot. Before you do anything, make sure to read all of the directions so you understand what you need to do and to confirm that you have the correct ballot with the right information. When you begin to fill out the ballot, make sure that you don't mark more than one choice allowed for each race, or your vote for that race will not be counted. To package your ballot correctly, make sure you use both envelopes if two are provided. One envelope is a smaller one and it will have a space to sign and date on the back. And the other envelope is larger and it's prepaid and addressed to the appropriate elections office. You must put your completed ballot into the smaller envelope first, seal it, sign and date the back, and then put that into the larger envelope and seal that. If you do make a mistake, there are usually directions included on your absentee ballot that can help you. But if not, there should be a contact number included in the packet and you can call that number. Many times you will have to request a new ballot, so be ready to have to do that. And Andrea, I know you had a little bit more to say about this as well.
Yeah, so another piece, we talked about voter suppression a little bit before. Another big piece of voter suppression is being nitpicky about ballots and using and discounting ballots for very simple reasons. And as I just want to highlight what Lily was saying, that it's so important that we actually go through all of the instructions of what's on a ballot, because simple things like circling a bubble instead of filling it in might actually discount your ballot. And I know it sounds like there are so many barriers and there are so many things that I need to be aware of. And that is just one of the things that we need to combat, right? One of the things that I always keep at the top of mind is that the way that we combat voter suppression is by having increased voter turnout. And when we have increased voter turnout, when we're able to go through the motions and actually bring our community to vote despite all of these barriers, that is when we can start breaking down those barriers. So being as detailed as possible is one thing important. And also figuring out who's on your ballot. Like I mentioned before, the things that we care about on a daily basis, there is an elected position that controls that issue. And figuring out what exactly is on your ballot. Are there ballot initiatives? Are there, what elections are happening? Who's up? What are the issues that they're talking about? And sharing with that your community goes a long way in making sure that folks are invested and that we are centering our communities and the issues that we care about in this process.
Absolutely. So while mail-in ballots are one option to get your vote in early, I know we kind of mentioned earlier some other ways to get your vote in, and some states don't offer them and make it hard for their residents to get them, like we said. If your state doesn't support mail-in voting and you can't go in person on election day, you might be able to vote early in person instead. Each state has different laws about early voting, kind of like Andrea was talking about earlier. And some states don't offer it. So you need to make sure you check your state's website in order to find out if you can vote early and when, since times vary from state to state. Vote.org actually has a great list of all early voting dates by state and polling locations. So if you do decide to visit the polls on election day, keep in mind that going in person has its own problems, just like all the other forms of voting. For the past years, we've been dealing with a national shortage of poll workers. And like Andrea mentioned before, poor areas and areas that are majority Black deal with longer lines and fewer polling locations. This is obviously a huge problem because not only are people of color kept from voting, but polling locations deal with mass confusion and miscounted ballots and thus voter suppression. And that is why it is so critical that people volunteer to be poll workers. In most states, poll workers must be qualified or registered electors. Generally, this means that they have to be a U.S. citizen, they have to be 18 years old, they have to meet their state's residency requirements, and they have to have no criminal history that would prevent them from voting. There are some exceptions, however. 46 states also allow youth younger than 18 to serve as poll workers. So if you're interested in voting, make sure volunteering, hope you're interested in voting as well. Make sure you look up your state laws and guidelines so that you know if you are eligible. And if you are, You can register to become a poll worker through Power the Polls in partnership with Defend Our Future. Andrea, can you tell us a little bit more about poll workers?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that beautiful outline. I think you said it perfectly. Right now, there is a huge need for folks to step up and provide, if they are able to step up and make sure that our communities are able to cast a ballot. One of the things to additionally consider, I know, Lily, you talked about some of the poll worker shortages that are leading to polling locations being closed and longer lines, specifically in communities that are low income or predominantly Black. And one of the things to also consider is that a lot of the folks that do historically have registered to be poll workers are over the age of 60. And that's two things. One, these are folks that are at higher risk in the time of a pandemic, and a lot of them are choosing to sit this one out. So that is contributing to shortages. But also, whenever folks like you in your community go to represent and become a poll worker at your polling location, that actually makes a huge difference. Whenever you're able to see somebody that you know from your community, or that looks like you, or that isn't over the age of 60 and you may not relate to as much, and no offense, all about intergenerational building. But that sometimes is a thing. When you go into a polling location, you might be intimidated by some of the folks that are leading these locations. And that is actually a reason why some people may choose to not cast a ballot. So when you are representing your community, somebody that looks like the community, somebody that is from the community, that is when we can make sure that the folks that are historically disenfranchised and historically not had access and not been welcome at polling locations actually are and actually do. Folks that are multilingual, if you speak other languages, that is huge. That is huge. And that is a huge way to leverage your privilege and leverage the access that you have to be able to do that. And I know you mentioned some of the requirements for registering to become a poll worker. I would just remind everyone to check what the requirements are in your state, and know that if there are requirements, that doesn't always mean that they are fair or that they are just. And those are things that we still need to be critical of. If you are not a US citizen, but still have the ability to become a poll worker, some states actually do allow that. But just double checking what those are, and knowing that if there are restrictions, that doesn't mean that they're always fair. We should always be critical of what are the things that are contributing to voter suppression.
Yes, absolutely. Always be aware. Well, I know this conversation has focused on all the challenges that we're facing. And, so many people don't have access to polling centers, or they have to work through election day and all this voter suppression. But I kind of wanted to aim this question specifically at people who don't want to vote or don't think that they should vote, even though they have the means to. Andrea, if you had to convince someone to vote who is in this category, what would you tell them?
Yes. So I first want to start off by we acknowledge that one of the reasons why folks may not cast a ballot is because they are disenfranchised, they experience barriers, and they're not able to. And then there's also folks that just honestly don't want to F with the system. They don't want to engage. And I want to first acknowledge and name that. That is very valid, and that is very real for a lot of communities. And I don't think enough people, specifically in the civic engagement space, recognize that. A lot of people feel very disenchanted by the system, by a system that was never created for communities of color, for women, for low income, for immigrants, for folks that have been historically disenfranchised. It was never meant for us to participate. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of folks, it's very legitimate. Why am I going to participate in a system that wasn't created for me? And so we need to acknowledge that. And the second piece is we also need to acknowledge that historically, our communities have not been taught how the civic process relates to the issues that we care about. So there's a lot of blaming for young people or people that don't vote, like, oh, you're being irresponsible, or you're just being lazy. There's a lot of shaming that comes with it. But one of the things that we need to realize is that it has been intentional that communities that historically haven't voted don't have access to understanding why it matters in the first place, and what are the things that, how it relates to the issues that they care about. And this has been intentional. So it separates elections from the issues that we face on a day-to-day. So specifically, you know, marginalized communities are worried about their immediate needs, like staying healthy during COVID, while they are, you know, doing the job of frontline workers and essential workers, or putting food on the table as unemployment benefits are being reduced, or rent freezes are being halted. So our communities, those are the things that they're putting importance on. But whenever we're able to merge the two and say, the reason that right now you are not able to put food on your table, the reason why right now you are not being provided hazard pay as a frontline worker is because of the people that we put into these positions. There is someone at every level of government that is in charge of making sure that there are rent freezes, that you have unemployment benefits, that your community has USPS drop-off ballot locations. There is somebody that is making those decisions. And whenever we're able to make those connections, and more than that is providing that civics education to our communities about how government functions at every level, and what are the positions what do these people do, essentially. And so just to provide kind of like an example of kind of what this might look like, is we know that in Flint, Michigan, for example, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy is responsible for the water quality of the state. But if you know that the governor is actually the person in charge of appointing the head of that department, it becomes clear why it's important to vote for your governor. Because all of these things like water quality are all related to different aspects of government, and there are people in charge of all of these things that are so personal to us. So we need to provide our communities with the necessary information to understand how government functions at every level, so it becomes clear why voting is critical in every election, not just a presidential election. And we actually break down how government functions at every level at the YP4's. We did a civic engagement training series over the summer where we did an overview of local, state, federal, and international governance. So if you go to our YouTube, it's a bit.ly link, bit.ly/YP4watch, that you'll have access to all of that free training, so that you can bring that information back to your communities.
Absolutely. That was just wonderfully put, Andrea. I could never have said that any better. But unfortunately, we are coming to the last segment. And for this, I just wanted to provide everyone with a few resources on voting and voter rights. So the first one is vote.org. I think we've mentioned it a couple times, but they use technology to simplify political engagement, increase voter turnout, and strengthen democracy. Another one is the Brennan Center for Justice, who works to protect the integrity of voting rights and elections. And they're actually a great place to get started if you want to educate yourself on voter suppression. Another one is the Andrew Goodman Foundation, who works to make sure young voices are heard and helps get accessibility to young people across America. Another one is Rock the Vote, which encourages youth to access their right to vote and connects with each generation and represents them. And of course, we have Young People For, which is a national network that centers Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, and LGBTQ plus leaders in education, media, politics, business, government, and everywhere. Did you have any that you wanted to add, Andrea?
I just want to say that we have a lot of resources available at Young People For through our YouTube, on our Instagram as well. And I know that you're going to be doing a shout out in a little bit. But one of the things that we center on is providing those resources so that our communities have the information to make the connections between the ballot box and the issues that we care about, so that we can shift away from a model of temperamental voting, one-off elections, and understanding the context of what's at stake and how our participation is connected to all of this.
Great, yes. Those are, amazing resources. But unfortunately, this is the end. And, this has been such a great conversation. I learned so much from you across the board about voting. And I wanted to thank you for joining me today. And in case you wanted to find either of us on social media, you can find me, Lily Duffield, on Twitter at Lily_Duffield. And that's LILY_DUFFIELD. And you can find EDF Action on Twitter and Facebook at EDF Action, or you can visit the website at edfaction.org. You can also find Defend Our Future on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Defend Our Future, or you can visit the Defend Our Future website at defendourfuture.org. Andrea, where can the viewers find you and Young People For?
Yes, of course. So my Twitter is just at Andrea Sosa, ANDREASOSA. And then on YP4, for Twitter, it is at YP4. On Instagram, it's at Young People For, and our website is yp4.org or youngpeople4.org. So if you just search YP4 or Young People For, you'll be able to find us. Like I mentioned, we're also on YouTube. You'll be able to find the link in our Instagram bio for all of these free resources that I just mentioned. And yeah, I hope that everyone that's watching follows along and continues this path of learning and understanding how our communities are connected to the ballot, and that we're prepared for November, not just us, but everyone.
Yes, me too. And thank you so much again. Goodbye.
Thank you.